Most people do not realize they are being managed. That is the first thing you must understand. Not manipulated in the obvious sense. No one is pulling strings above you in a dark room, but managed subtly, continuously, by the accumulated weight of other people's perceptions, expectations, and quiet calculations about what you will and will not tolerate. You walk through your days believing you are making free choices, and in a narrow sense, you are. But the conditions of those choices, what you fear, what you desire, what you believe about yourself, and what you are owed, those conditions were shaped long before you arrived at the moment of choosing. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He saw that most human beings live not from their own center, but from a story about themselves that other people helped write. And he saw that the moment you begin to read that story critically, the moment you hold it up to light and recognize the hands that shaped it, everything changes. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently. This is not a video about becoming ruthless. It is not a manual for cruelty. Nietzsche was not a guide for those who wish to harm others. He was, in the most precise sense, a diagnostician, someone who examined the body of human civilization and described, with uncomfortable accuracy, what he found. He found that strength and goodness were not natural enemies. He found that the most dangerous person in any room was not the most aggressive, but the most aware. And he found that the greatest suffering in human life was not caused by villains with obvious intentions, but by good people who could not see the game clearly enough to stop being hurt by it. What follows are 7 rules drawn from that diagnosis. Not commandments, not manipulations. Rules, in the sense that gravity is a rule, in the sense that the tide is a rule. Patterns so deeply embedded in how human beings actually operate, as opposed to how they believe they should operate, that they function whether or not you acknowledge them. You can choose to ignore them. Many people do. But ignoring a law does not suspend it. It only removes your ability to navigate by it. The first rule is this: perception governs reality, not truth alone. There is a belief, and it is almost universal among people who think of themselves as principled, that if you are honest, if your intentions are good, if your actions are consistent and fair, the world will reflect that back to you. That eventually, the truth of who you are will speak for itself. Nietzsche spent his career dismantling this belief, not because he was cynical, but because he was precise. He understood that the social world does not run on truth. It runs on perception, on the story that circulates about you in rooms you are not in the pause before someone introduces you, in the way your name lands in a conversation. There are no facts, he wrote, only interpretations. This is not nihilism. It is mechanics. It means that the story others tell about you is a real force in your life, regardless of its accuracy. And it means that the person who allows others to construct that story unchallenged is, in a very practical sense, handing them the controls. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that managing perception is somehow dishonest, that the authentic person simply exists and lets the truth win. The reality Nietzsche observed is that the authentic person who ignores narrative becomes the victim of whatever narrative others find convenient. Not because the world is evil, but because narratives fill whatever space you leave empty. The first law: the story told about you is real in its consequences. You may author it, or you may inherit someone else's version. There is no third option. The second rule: emotional transparency is a map to your vulnerabilities. This is perhaps the most difficult rule for people who value openness and authenticity, because it sounds, on the surface, like a case for coldness. It is not. Nietzsche was not advocating for the suppression of feeling. He was making a structural observation about how human dynamics work. When you allow every emotion to surface immediately, when frustration is always visible, when anxiety leaks into your posture, when joy is announced before it is secure, you are giving those around you real-time intelligence about what moves you, about what you need, about what can be used as leverage. History is full of individuals who were not defeated by superior force, but by superior knowledge. Knowledge of where the cracks were, knowledge of what would crack them further. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that vulnerability, when shared, creates connection and earns trust. And sometimes it does. But in environments where there are those who are more interested in advantage than in intimacy, vulnerability shared without discernment is vulnerability offered as a weapon. Nietzsche's insight was not that you should become unfeeling. It was that composure is not the suppression of the inner life. It is the sovereign management of what you allow to surface, when and in front of whom. Your emotions remain yours. Your expression of them is a choice. The second law: what you reveal, others will use, not always against you, but always about you. The third rule: weak responses to deliberate harm are not kindness. They are instruction. There is a particular kind of person who believes that tolerance is a virtue without limit, that absorbing aggression gracefully, forgiving without conditions, declining to respond to cruelty, is a mark of character. And in certain moments, it is. But Nietzsche's observation was more precise than this. The way you respond to the first violation sets the terms for all future violations. When you soften in the face of deliberate harm, when you explain it away, minimize it, or absorb it silently to preserve peace, you are not demonstrating patience. You are demonstrating that the cost of that action was acceptable. And people, in the way that all creatures learn, repeat actions whose costs were acceptable. This is not malice. This is mechanics. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that measured, gentle responses will be read as magnanimous, that they will earn respect. The reality Nietzsche observed is that response calibrates expectation, that the person who responds precisely and proportionately to the first deliberate harm almost never has to respond to a second, not because they have frightened the other person, but because they have communicated something fundamental, that the terrain here has a structure, and that structure includes consequence. The third law: what you permit the first time, you have quietly licensed for every time after. The fourth rule: premature visibility creates targets before you are ready. There is a specific kind of ambition, eager, transparent, almost endearing, that announces itself before it is secure, that shares the plan before the foundation is built, that celebrates the beginning as if it were the end, that mistakes enthusiasm for strategy. Nietzsche was fascinated by what he called the will to power, not domination over others, but the drive to become fully what one is capable of being. And he noticed that this drive was most vulnerable in its early stages, precisely because it had not yet built the conditions for its own protection. When you reveal capability too early, you invite resistance from those who would rather that capability not develop. When you announce intent before you have the position to act on it, you give those with competing interests the time to organize against you. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that sharing your vision invites support. Sometimes it does, but in environments shaped by competition and comparison, visible aspiration is also a signal, one that others read and respond to with their own calculations. Nietzsche's insight was that strength grows best in silence, not because secrecy is virtuous, but because early stages require protection, and protection requires not having announced yourself as something worth dismantling. The fourth law: the most secure position is the one your opposition does not see coming. The fifth rule: respect and affection are not created the same way, and confusing them is the most expensive mistake in human relationships. Nietzsche was deeply interested in what he called the slave morality, the inversion by which weakness is renamed virtue, by which the inability to demand respect becomes reframed as noble self-sacrifice. He saw it operating everywhere in human relationships, in the person who gives endlessly, hoping that generosity will convert to admiration, in the person who makes themselves perpetually available, hoping that accessibility will convert to value, in the person who withholds all edges, hoping that softness will earn durability. Affection, real affection, can be earned in many ways. But respect, the deep structural kind, the kind that endures under pressure, is not created by warmth. It is created by posture, by the perception that someone has an inner life that does not collapse under external pressure, that they have standards they actually enforce, that they will not adjust their character to maintain your comfort. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that being loved and being respected follow the same path, that if you are warm enough, generous enough, easy enough to be around, both will follow. The reality Nietzsche observed is that the strategies that generate affection sometimes directly undermine respect, that the person who makes themselves entirely available becomes familiar rather than valued, that depth requires distance, and presence requires selectivity. The fifth law: you cannot purchase respect. You can only embody the qualities that make it unavoidable. And here is where we must slow down, because at this point in the argument, something happens to almost everyone who encounters Nietzsche's observations about power and human behavior. A resistance arrives. It feels like an objection to the philosophy, but it is actually something older than that, a defense of a more comfortable model of the world. The comfortable model says that these observations are for cynics, that the person who learns them will use them to harm others, that acknowledging how power actually operates is the first step toward becoming someone who exploits it. This resistance is not stupid. It comes from a real place, from the recognition that awareness of these mechanisms can be misused, that the map can be wielded as a weapon. But Nietzsche's project was never to create manipulators. His project was to rescue goodness from its own innocence. He watched, across history, the pattern of people with genuine value, generosity, integrity, vision, who were consistently outmaneuvered by people with less of it, simply because the former refused to see the terrain clearly. He was not writing for the predator. He was writing for the capable person who had been taught that their capability required their vulnerability, that to be good, you must also be available to be used. This is the lie these rules are designed to dismantle, not to make you hard, to make you whole, to separate goodness from helplessness and capability from naivety. The person who internalizes what follows does not become cruel. They become illegible to cruelty. That is the real liberation. The sixth rule: elevation is more powerful than confrontation. Nietzsche understood something about the nature of enemies that most people get wrong. We imagine that the most effective response to opposition is direct combat, that you face what threatens you, defeat it, and move forward. But direct confrontation has a structural problem. It takes place on terrain that both parties recognize, which means the opposition has time to prepare. More than that, it elevates the conflict to a level of significance that may not serve you. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the self-overcoming individual, was not defined by what it defeated, but by what it transcended. The person who responds to opposition by becoming more, by building in directions the opposition cannot follow, by creating value so significant that the original threat becomes irrelevant. This person wins in a way that confrontation never allows. History is full of individuals who were threatened by lesser forces and chose not to fight them, but to outgrow them. The arena the opposition chose was abandoned. The individual simply moved to a different level. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that every challenge requires a direct answer, that every attack demands a counterattack. The reality Nietzsche observed is that your attention is your most valuable resource, and every confrontation you choose to enter is a decision about where to spend it. The sixth law, the most decisive victory, is the one that made the battle irrelevant. The seventh rule: your emotional center is the only territory that cannot be taken. This is, in the end, where all of Nietzsche's philosophy arrives. Not at domination, not at power over others, but at something quieter and more absolute. Sovereignty over the self, the understanding that the person who cannot be moved by provocation, who cannot be destabilized by other people's chaos, who cannot be extracted from their own center by manipulation, flattery, or aggression. This person is, in any practical sense, unconquerable. Not because they are invulnerable, but because the most powerful tactics others possess, the ability to produce fear, shame, anger, doubt, have lost their leverage. Nietzsche wrote about amor fati, the love of fate, the willingness to affirm one's life completely, including its difficulties, without requiring different conditions to be at peace. This is not passive resignation. It is the active cultivation of a self that does not depend on external validation for its stability. The naive belief this rule dismantles is that peace comes from circumstances, that when things settle down, when people treat you better, when the situation improves, you will finally be okay. The reality Nietzsche observed is that peace comes from posture, not from position. That the person who waits for the world to become kind before they become stable will wait forever. The seventh law: the interior life is the only life fully yours. Defend it accordingly. And now you have arrived at the place this entire argument was moving toward. Not the end, but the opening, the beginning of a way of seeing that, once adopted, cannot be set aside. What changes when you internalize these rules is not your behavior exactly. It is your field of vision. The manipulation that once confused you becomes obvious. You can see the mechanism clearly enough to name it before it completes itself. The attack that once hurt you becomes predictable. You have already mapped the terrain, and surprise is no longer available to those who would use it. The person who once destabilized you with their instability becomes simply a weather pattern, something you observe with clarity and move through with composure. This is what Nietzsche was building toward in everything he wrote. Not a philosophy of domination, a philosophy of clarity. The understanding that the world operates by laws that do not care whether you acknowledge them, and that the person who refuses to look clearly at those laws is not more virtuous for their ignorance. They are simply more exposed to the consequences of it. The greatest transformation does not happen when you defeat your enemies. It does not happen when you master the tactics of power or learn to see manipulation before it reaches you. It happens the moment you realize that their tactics, the full arsenal of pressure and provocation and calculated chaos that human beings aim at each other, no longer lands in you the way it used to. Not because you have hardened, but because you have finally settled into your own assessment of things, into your own knowledge of what is true, into the particular stillness of someone who has stopped needing the world to be different than it is, and started moving through it clearly, with open eyes. That is what Nietzsche meant. That is what he was always pointing toward. Not the will to power over others, but the will to stop being controlled by forces you were never taught to name. Now you can name them,